Regular session of the 17th Congress is hereby called to order. Senator Panfilo Lacson will lead us in prayer.
Ever-loving God, with all your omnipotence and kindness we pray. Teach us not to succumb to life's challenges, but rise above them. Fight evil in a way that it doesn't break our soul and spirit. Stand up to the truth amid all the prevarications that confuse us. Forgive our iniquities as we clasp our hands in supplication. Make our conscience our constant guide in our everyday life. Admonish us to pray not only for ourselves, but for the next generation of Filipinos who will remember the values and disvalues of our generation. All this we ask in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Senator Lacson. Secretary, please call the roll.
Roll call members. The Honorable Senator Sangara, Aquino, Binay, Cayetano, De Lima, Drillon, Ejercito, Escudero, Gatchalian, Gordon, Honasan, Ontiveros, Lacson, Legarda, Pacquiao, Pangilinan, Po, Recto, Soto, Trillanes, Villanueva, Villar, Suberi, Senate President Pimentel.
Andyan siya. Senator Legarda. With 17 senators present, the chair declares the presence of a quorum. Majority Leader.
Thank you. Mr. President, I move that we dispense with the reading of the journal of the 34th session, Monday, October 17th, and consider the same as approved.
Is there any objection? There being none, the motion is approved.
Thank you, Mr. President. We'd like to acknowledge guests in the gallery who was visiting the Senate. Guests of Senator Legarda, Mayor Jesse Galano of Paway, Ilocos Norte, and members of the Sangguniang Bayan of Paway, Ilocos Norte, and several barangay captains, Mr. President. Also, Vice Mayor Rico Goles of Parañaque City, and Acting Mayor Noemi Espinosa from Santa Fe, Cebu, together with the members of the Sangguniang Bayan of Santa Fe, Cebu. I'd like to acknowledge also the guests of Senator Pacquiao, the Department of Health Secretary, Pauline Jean Rosel Ubial, and several representatives from the Department of Health. And the guests of Senator Mig Subiri, Sangguniang Bayan members of Alcala, Pangasinan, Top Gius Peregrino, Johnny Carahay, Eduardo de la Cruz, Eduardo Cruz Sr., together with Barangay Captain Manuel Salvador. I'd like to welcome them to the Senate, Mr. President, with your...
Welcome to our guests, the local government officials, all the way from Paway, Ilocos Norte, Pangasinan, to Cebu, and Parañaque, as well as the Department of Health Secretary. And I also see CHED Commissioner De Vera is also here. So welcome to the Senate, to all of our guests.
Thank you. Mr. President, I move that we proceed with the reference of business.
Is there any objection? There being none, the motion is approved. Secretary, reference of business.
1201, an act providing for the establishment of breast care centers in every region nationwide, appropriating funds therefore and for other purposes, by Senator Cynthia Villar.
Referred to the Committees on Health and Demography, Local Government and Finance.
1202, an act prohibiting text scams, misleading advertisements, and fraudulent sales promotions, mandating for this purpose the registration of all users of subscriber identity module cards and providing penalties for the violations thereof, by Senator Cynthia Villar.
To the Committees on Public Services and Trade, Commerce and Entrepreneurship.
1203, an act creating a friendly working environment for women and for other purposes, by Senator Vicente Soto III.
To the Committees on Labor, Employment and Human Resources Development, and Women, Children, Family Relations and Gender Equality.
1204, an act instituting corporate income tax reform, amending for this purpose sections 27 and 28 of the National Internal Revenue Code of 1997 as amended, and for other purposes, Senator Maria Lourdes Nancy Binay.
To the Committee on Ways and Means.
Resolutions, number 195, directing the Senate Committees on Justice and Human Rights and Cultural Communities to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the root causes of internal displacement of indigenous cultural communities, indigenous peoples, with the end in view of enacting legislation to uphold rights of internally displaced persons by Senator Laila de Lima.
To the Committees on Justice and Human Rights and Cultural Communities.
196, resolution commending and congratulating the Filipino athletes who bagged 21 medals during the 5th Asian Beach Games in Vietnam by Senator Emmanuel Manny Pacquiao.
To the Committee on Rules.
197, resolution directing the appropriate Senate committees to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation to look into issues and controversies surrounding the failure of some cooperatives to obtain import and or export license for permit by Senator Zubiri.
To the Committees on Cooperatives and Trade, Commerce and Entrepreneurship.
198, resolution congratulating and commending the Philippine team for winning 3 gold and 5 bronze medals in the 10th World Taekwondo Pomsei Championship held on September 29 to October 4, 2016 in Lima, Peru. Senator Maria Lourdes Nancy Binay.
To the Committee on Rules.
199, resolution directing the proper Senate committees to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the reports that terrorist groups in Mindanao joined forces to establish an Islamic State or ISIS satellite extension in the Philippines by Senator Maria Lourdes Nancy Binay.
To the Committees on National Defense and Security and Public Order and Dangerous Drugs.
Additional reference of business. Message of the President of the Philippines. Letter of President Rodrigo Roa Duterte, dated 11 October 2016, certifying to the necessity of the immediate enactment of House Bill number 3408, entitled An Act Appropriating Funds for the Operation of the Government of the Republic of the Philippines from January 1 to December 31, 2017, and for other purposes, in order to address the need to maintain continuous government operations following the end of the current fiscal year, to expedite the funding of various programs, projects, and activities for fiscal year 2017, and to ensure budgetary preparedness that will enable the government to effectively perform its constitutional mandate.
To the Committee on Rules.
1205, an act establishing the Sustainable Development Goals and Ambition Natin 2040 Fund, introduced by Senator Sani Angara.
To the Committees on Economic Affairs and Finance.
1206, an act creating the Banana Industry Development Council and providing funds thereof and for other purposes by Senator Cynthia Villar.
To the Committees on Agriculture and Food and Finance.
Resolutions, number 200, resolution directing the Committee on National Defense and Security to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the alleged pilferage, smuggling at the government arsenal in light of the seizure of Philippine peso 6 million pesos worth of high-powered firearms and ammunition belonging to the government arsenal, purportedly intended to be sold for Abu Sayyaf Group and warlords in ARMM by Senator Trillanes IV.
To the Committee on National Defense and Security.
201, resolution directing the Committee on Public Order and Dangerous Drugs to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the alleged involvement of some members of the Philippine National Police in the numerous extrajudicial killings in the country. with the end in view of revisiting the Philippine National Police Reform Act to ensure that the constitutionally enshrined mandate of the Philippine National Police to serve and protect remains to be upheld by Senator Trillanes IV.
To the Committee on Public Order and Dangerous Drugs.
Number 202, resolution directing the Committee on Civil Service, Government Reorganization, and Professional Regulation to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the alleged widespread practice of hiring tens of thousands of contractual and job order employees and other irregularities committed by various agencies and instrumentalities of government, as well as local government units, with the end in view of enacting remedial legislation for the Civil Service Commission to formulate guidelines for the hiring of contractual and job order personnel in the government and ensuring the protection of the rights and interests of the affected employees by Senator Trillanes IV.
To the Committee on Civil Service, Government Organization, and Professional Regulation.
203, resolution calling for the continued recognition of existence of the Negros Island region by Senator Zubiri.
To the Committee on Local Government.
204, resolution congratulating and commending Mark Anthony Kakal for winning the Best Customer Service for Food and Beverage Award in the 2016 Singapore Tourism Awards. Senator Maria Lourdes Nancy Binay.
To the Committee on Rules. Majority Leader.
Mr. President, we'd like to also acknowledge some guests in the gallery. Guests of Senator Gordon and Senator Angara, Mr. President. We have Right Honorable Lord Jack McConnell of Glens Corodale, the House of Lords, and Mr. Garrett McGrath of Politics Plus, Mr. Rupert Compton, Second Secretary for Political and Security of the British Embassy, and Mr. Michael Avoy, and also guests of Senator Legarda, Julia Reese of the UNICEF, and ASEC Amy Neri of the Department of Justice, also Ms. Normina Mojica of the Council for the Welfare of Children, National Nutrition Council, Ms. Karina Santiago, and Mr. Reginaldo Guillen, Nutrition Officer. We'd like to welcome them also to the Senate, Mr. President.
Welcome to all of our guests.
Mr. President, last Tuesday, October 11, Senator Dick Gordon took the floor on a matter of public interest to divulge the issue on the alleged 3.5 billion worth of questionable dengue vaccines that had been administered by the Department of Health to almost 280,000 students without passing through the so-called WHO pre-qualification requirements to ensure the vaccine's safety and effectivity. Now, this speech was then referred to the Committee on Rules, as per the request of Senator Gordon, for the committee to further study as to which committee the speech can be properly referred for competent deliberation. Now, Mr. President, after having thoroughly reviewed the speech and its subsequent interpellations, and after conducting our own research on the matter, we believe that the allegation on the possible involvement of irregularities to administer the school-based mass vaccination program, even before it was pre-qualified by the WHO, may merit investigation to focus primarily on the possible culpability of previous and present officials of the DBM, the DOH, and other concerned ranking officials in the executive branch of the previous government on the misuse of 3.5 billion government funds. So with that, Mr. President, as your chair on the Committee on Rules, I move that the privileged speech of Senator Gordon be referred to the Committee on Accountability of Public Officers and Investigations as the primary referral, the Committee on Health and Demography as the secondary referral, as well as the Committee on Finance, which will soon report out the budget of the DOH. I so move, Mr. President.
There is a motion to refer the privileged speech delivered by Senator Gordon last October 11, which covered the matter of the alleged questionable dengue vaccines worth 3.5 billion pesos, to refer this to the Committee on Accountability of Public Officers and Investigations as the primary committee, and the Committee on Health and Demography as secondary, as well as the Committee on Finance. Any objection? Hearing none, the motion is approved.
Thank you, Mr. President. To speak on a matter of public interest, may we recognize Senator Lauren Legarda?
Is there any objection? Hearing none, Senator Legarda is recognized to speak on a matter of public interest.
Mr. President, October is National Indigenous Peoples Month, a celebration of our cultural diversity, an opportune time to honor our IPs and their overwhelming contributions to our history, our culture, our heritage. The Philippine Constitution recognizes this diversity and, under the framework of national unity and development, mandates state recognition, protection, promotion, and fulfillment of the rights of our indigenous people. The Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, the IPRA of 1997, outlines the special measures to ensure that the rights of IPs to lands and territories, economic development and self-determination, cultural integrity, and access to basic social services are promoted, respected, and fulfilled by the government. Likewise, numerous international treaties, conventions, and declarations with similar objectives were entered into by the government. We have supported a historic United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which articulated their individual and collective rights. Despite concerted efforts exerted by the government in partnership with various private organizations and adequate financial support from international communities, still, our IPs remain a marginalized sector of our society. Mr. President, this speech is not only to call or to celebrate, but also is an earnest plea to call everyone's attention to a segment of the indigenous population who are invisible, disenfranchised, and discriminated, our indigenous Filipino children. We acknowledge that there are initiatives within government agencies to fulfill the rights of our indigenous children. The Department of Education has established the IP Education Office, which helps implement education programs for IPs and develop education programs that will meet the learning needs of the IP communities. The DSWD has the IP participation framework and the modified conditional cash transfer for indigenous peoples in geographically isolated and disadvantaged areas under the Pantawid Pamilyang Pilipino program. The Department of Health has joined with the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples and the Department of Interior and Local Government to address various issues in the provision of basic health services for the IP communities. However, even with these initiatives, the lack of data on indigenous children makes it difficult to measure the results of our existing programs. There are no accurate figures on the IP population given the lack of census data. The most recent figures, based on an unofficial survey conducted by the NCIP, estimates the IP population between 12 and 15 million, accounting for approximately 10 to 15% of the total population of the Philippines. There are an estimated 7 million indigenous children. But without accurate data on IP population, how sure are we that we are designing evidence-based and results-based programs and budgets for indigenous children? Are the indigenous children really benefiting from our government programs? The issue of inequity in access to quality education continues to be an alarming situation in the Philippines. Based on the estimate of the NCIP and the 2010 Philippine census data, there are around 4 to 5 million school-aged children from 5 to 15 years old who should be enrolled in kindergarten to grade 9. But data of DepEd in school year 2015 to 2016 shows that the enrollment of IP children at kindergarten to grade 6 or the elementary level is around 1.9 million, and only about 500,000 are actually enrolled in grade 7 to 11 secondary level. In total, there are only 2.4 million IP children enrolled in kindergarten to grade 11. Moreover, a main cause of many IP learners' difficulties in learning and completion of education is the lack of interface between the IP's indigenous knowledge, systems, and practices on the one hand, and the mainstream formal education system on the other. This is being addressed by the IP education program and the mother tongue-based multilingual education program of the DepEd. However, the program presently covers only 19 of the 175 indigenous languages in the country. And even when they get to school, the learning environment is not safe because indigenous children are targets of bullying and discrimination from other children and sometimes even school personnel. In a series of consultation workshops with indigenous children organized by Tebteba, one child narrated that after walking 10 kilometers to reach school, the teacher scolded and humiliated her because of her dirty feet, called her a native, and then sent her home. Mr. President, our indigenous communities have also been affected by the complex security situation involving the armed forces of the Philippines, the New People's Army, and other paramilitary groups. In 2015, approximately 17,035 individuals were displaced due to armed conflicts, and a significant number of grave violations involved IP children. An indigenous 14-year-old girl was raped by 3 soldiers in 3 separate incidents between May and July 2015. The soldiers were court-martialed, and their superior was recommended for administrative sanctions. However, the civilian criminal proceedings for rape were dismissed following an out-of-court settlement made by the alleged perpetrators with the victim's family. Following a series of killings of indigenous peoples in the same year, the UN Special Rapporteurs on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and on the situation of human rights defenders called on the Philippine government to launch an independent investigation into the deaths and to bring the perpetrators to justice. To date, none of the perpetrators have been arrested despite having been positively identified by the community that was forced to witness the killings. These are just a few of the many injustices our IPs continue to face. These are concerns raised by the UNICEF representative to the Philippines, Lotta Sile-Wonder, represented by Julia Reese, deputy representative. In bringing up these issues, they hope that our government will initiate programs that will immediately address these concerns. It is worth noting that the 2009 concluding observation of the Committee on the Rights of the Child acknowledged the steps taken by the Philippine government to address the situation of our indigenous children. However, the committee reiterated its concern about the widespread poverty among minorities and indigenous peoples and the limited enjoyment of their human rights, in particular concerning their access to social and health services and education. The committee also expressed concern at the lack of information about the actual impact of the application of the 1997 IPRA on children. The Philippines is due to submit its combined 5th and 6th periodic report to the Committee on the Rights of the Child on progress on the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child by September 19, 2017. The question is, will the Philippines be able to report good progress for our indigenous children? It is still not too late, but the first step we need to take is to ensure inclusivity, to embrace our indigenous brothers and sisters as part of our society. I am confident that the present administration will provide our indigenous communities the appropriate programs, sufficient basic services, and proper recognition they truly deserve. We still have a long way to go in effectively protecting the rights of our IPs, but we should not lose hope. We must continue to work together and assure the role and significance of our IPs, more particularly our IP children in our country. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Legarda. What is the pleasure of Senator Subiri?
Thank you, Mr. President. With the permission of the Majority Floor Leader, would the gentle lady from Antique answer a few questions?
Yes, Mr. President, to the senator from Bukidnon, Mindanao, in the Philippines, whose province has several indigenous peoples group, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. And, well, I congratulate the lady senator for bringing this issue up on IP children, the plight of our indigenous peoples. Mr. President, you know, Bukidnon or we're blessed rather, with having a large population of IPs. We have the 7 tribes of Bukidnon, the Higaonons, the Laandigs, the Manobos, Matigsalogs, the Bukidnons, and several others. And almost 30% of our population, Mr. President, are IP communities. But would the lady senator be aware of the reasons why lumad killings persist in these particular areas? Even we in Bukidnon have a problem of lumad killings. As a matter of fact, Mr. President, we have several IP communities that are held out or camping actually in rescue centers in front of the provincial capital of Bukidnon. Would the lady senator be aware?
Yes. Yes, Mr. President. In fact, if you will recall, last year, the lumad killings in Lianga, Surigao Sur, was also brought to the national attention. In fact, there were hearings conducted in Davao City, and I wonder what has happened to the investigation into the lumad killings. Yes, Mr. President, there are many reasons why our indigenous peoples, our children, are rendered most vulnerable. First, there is that, whether we accept it or not, innate discrimination on our indigenous people. So when we say indigenous children, they are twice discriminated upon. First, they are from indigenous families. Second, they are children. And third, perhaps, they're even located in the most far-flung areas of the country, which have least access to our basic social protection services. And so for these reasons, they are rendered most vulnerable. Second, perhaps because of their lack of education, because of lack of access to education, because of their lack of access to health care, they are often the victims of bullying and even the victims of the internal strife and war between the AFP and our MILF, MNLF, Abu Sayyaf, or even the New People's Army. That's why I believe that the peace efforts of the current administration will really augur well for those in the rural areas, especially our indigenous peoples. Yes. And so there are many reasons why they are often the victims of killings and harassment. It is cultural, it is political, it is also borne out by the fact that they are usually located in areas where there are tensions between the AFP and the insurgent forces.
Thank you, Mr. President. Madam Senator Legarda actually hit the nail right on the head. There are several factors, as she mentioned, cultural, also the militarization, as she mentioned earlier, because of the internal strife. Many of our IPs have decided to take sides. Some IP communities would be siding with the military and government. The other IP community would be siding with the New People's Army in this fight against the government. And what happens ultimately, Mr. President, is the IP communities suffer. You know, sometimes several datos of one tribe choosing sides, and it becomes personal to them, although not personal maybe to government and the New People's Army, but to them, because they stay in one particular community, it becomes a personal vendetta, and sometimes it causes rido. And many times, nagkakapatayan po, Mr. President. And I agree with the lady senator from Antique and Malabon that these nomad killings should stop. As a matter of fact, we should demilitarize these areas, because I'm hopeful now, Mr. President, and I'm glad that the lady senator took this up, because I'm hopeful now with the peace efforts both on the side of the military and the New People's Army, that we can finally demilitarize these areas and actually try to come up with a long-lasting solution for cohabitation amongst these different tribal communities. In Bukidnon, the Kaambulan Festival was actually an enactment. The celebration of the Kaambulan Festival was actually the enactment of the coming together of the 7 tribes of Bukidnon. That's the Kaambulan. And it happened not too long ago, as a matter of fact, Mr. President. This happened during martial law. I think what happened was they'd always be fighting each other for territory. What then President Marcos had done, together with the Panamin of Mr. Elizalde, was to put the tribes together. They met together, they had a peace pact. And that was the Kaamulan, and that started the Kaamulan Festival, the recognition of the coming together of the 7 tribes. Unfortunately, we need to reenact that again, because many of our, and not only in Bukidnon, but even in Agusan, in Surigao, as you mentioned, even in North Cotabato, many of our IP communities now are militarized. They had to take up arms, well, in a way, because of the different struggles that they face every day. Hunger is one of them. And so I'm going to my next point, basically. Does the good senator know that in the hunger incidences of the PSA, or the hunger survey of the Philippine Statistics Authority, would you be aware, Madam Senator, that many of those in the top 20 are actually provinces with a high density of indigenous peoples?
You're correct. In fact, your province is in the 20 poorest provinces, and so is the province of Senator Pacquiao, Sarangani, with a population of indigenous people as well. And many of those provinces are found in Mindanao. And so it is important that as we craft our budget for 2017, we are sensitive to the needs of our indigenous people, whether it is for the CCT program under the 4Ps, or it is the DepEd school building program, access to education, access to the CCT. When the North Cotabato incident happened, Kidapawan, was it a year ago, some IPs, Manobos, came to the Senate and they said that they were not even afforded the services of government. And I asked the government agencies then, why were they not beneficiaries of the 4Ps or CCT? And they said, because we did not know how to find them, because they were all the way in the mountains. And I think what we really need to do to be able to effectively address this issue is to have extension workers to really find out where our indigenous peoples are in the most far-flung sitios in the country, so that they can be included in the 4Ps program of government. And even when they are included, for them to be able to avail of it, they should be a different program for them, because the requirement would be based on those in the urban areas or rural areas, but not IPs, meaning they must be in school, in a DepEd school, but maybe this child or IP child cannot even comply with the requirements of a DepEd school. Maybe the language he or she was born into is the language, indigenous language of a Manobo or a Talaingod, which is not taught in the Visayan school.
Yes.
So I am informed that these sensitivities must be taken into consideration in the implementation of the programs of government.
I'm thankful, Mr. President, that the lady senator and I see eye to eye on this issue, because it's really a multi-sectoral, multi-agency approach. She's correct, Bukidnon is in the top 10, and because we were hit with a very bad El Nino, it was about 10 months of no rain in Bukidnon. And you know, most of the IP communities, because of their culture and tradition, they do not want to go down from the uplands and the hinterlands. which are the most affected when it comes to El Nino, because obviously it's not lowland, so you have no irrigation.
Walang tubig.
Walang tubig, they cannot grow anything, not everything that they grow would die, and it's actually desertified in some areas where there's forest fires and brush fires. So they're really, really affected. And so this representation, together with the good chairperson of the Finance Committee, has been trying not only for Bukidnon, but for the other provinces like Sarangani and even the Maguindanao area, Sultan del Norte, Zamboanga del Norte, and other provinces. We've been trying to come up with a approach that the budget should be a multi-agency convergence for poverty reduction. It cannot just be kanya-kanyang programa. That's why I'm very happy that when I hear the chairperson of the Finance Committee, Senator Legarda, castigating the DENR for its lack of malasakit when it comes to their greening program, because for obvious reasons, she's also an environmentalist. She knows exactly what will survive when you do a greening program, and we both agree that it should be agroforestry. We discussed earlier the use of even coconuts, things that would feed the IP communities in the highlands. And it should be not just the DNR, it should be the NCIP, it should be given more importance by national government agencies, knowing the fact that the PSA has ranked the IP communities out of 100%, in the PSA it's about a high of 70% poverty index for IPs. Napakataas. So,
They're considered actually the poorest of the poor.
poorest to the
And
poor.
what we need to do is really to be able to locate them. And the
Yes.
PSA must need to update their statistics because, as I mentioned, our indigenous children are more often than not invisible. They're not carried in our statistics in the PSA. They're not accounted for in our health or DSW programs all the time because they're not in our database.
Yes.
So what we need to do first is to know exactly where they are. And I think the best way to do it is to really have extension workers, as there are extension workers in the agricultural sector. There must be extension workers for agencies of government that provides basic services to our indigenous peoples.
Would the lady senator agree with me that sometimes we have to take a step further to be able to do drastic measures to prevent poverty, particularly on the issue on IPs, on the IP communities, to take a step further by really focusing on education for the next generation? I've had my frustrations being a former congressman from Bukidnon, and my district has one of the highest density of IP communities. And I've had my frustrations dealing with the fathers and the grandfathers when it comes to poverty eradication. For example, you and I are both environmentalists, Mr. President, the lady senator and I, and there are times that I would be arguing with them and saying that there are better ways to utilize your ancestral domain, because sometimes for them to cut all the trees, it's all up to them because that's their ancestral domain, and now they're regretting it because they have no more trees. Now they're suffering from flooding and soil erosion and all this. But I've gotten my horse, Mr. President, trying to explain to them, to the point that I've already looked beyond that and I've decided to go to the next generation. Would the lady senator agree with me that education plays a key role in uplifting these communities in the near future from poverty?
Yes, education, giving them access to education as everyone has access to it, but at the same time, we should also open our minds and our hearts in understanding their culture.
Yes.
In understanding their very rich culture and benefiting from it.
Well, Mr. President, also to put on record, there are a lot of programs in the DepEd with regards to IP schools. These are IP schools that they put in the hinterlands that are being, of course, Tess Daman is here, no? Senator Joel Villanueva. But there are IP schools to cater to the primary and secondary education for IP communities. I believe that the teachers that they get are IP teachers also. They teach in the language of the indigenous peoples, as you mentioned earlier,
Mother tongue.
the mother tongue, which is exactly what they need to be able to absorb, no, the absorptive capacity of the children, to absorb the lessons. And would the lady senator of the chairman or the chairman of the Committee on Finance support this move to increase budgets for IP schools in the country?
Yes, we just need to know how many are the IP schools and where are there a concentration of indigenous peoples, and there should be a matching of the IP schools. Also, the NCIP has a lot of work to do. We need to see the NCIP to gather data on the IP population, especially IP children. The issue here really is how can we develop programs targeting IP concerns if we don't know the profile of each community. So this is really a challenge to us. We want to help them, but if the NCIP does not help itself by providing the data to the SWD, to DepEd, to CHED, to the SUCs, to the DOH, to the agencies of government. So we must see greater engagement with the NCIP, and perhaps the Philippine Statistics Authority can also help them. If
Yes,
they're
Mr.
invisible, how can we help them?
I believe the NCIP requested a budget for the Philippine IP Ethnographic Survey, funding for 2017 budget. But Senator Drillon, wala po. He has his issues
A
with the
survey
NCIP.
on where they are located.
I believe so. I think the
Yes.
PSA, the Philippine Statistics Authority, can do that job. And I agree with Senator Drillon. He has his frustrations with the NCIP. I have my frustrations with the
We
NCIP.
have our frustrations as well.
You know, they
I've
should be,
told them about our
Mr. President, they should be more proactive in the way they deal with our IP communities. Right now, it's just offices being filled up by personnel, not to cast any aspersion or bad light at them, but I would like to see an NCIP that is more proactive. I'm sure that the senator from Capiz and Malabon will agree with me. Then that they give, for example, for Region 10, they have a master plan for how to be able to support the IP communities and how these IP communities can survive and how the government agencies can help and assist, rather than us here, the legislators, trying to come up with some sort of master plan for them. Because when I asked them during our hearing in the budget, really, they were just thanking me for the support of coming up with a master plan for our IP communities in Bukidnon, because apparently they didn't have any. So with that, Mr. President, you know, me and the Senator Legarda are one heart, one mind, one soul when we feel that there should be a plan to assist our IP children, the children of indigenous communities, as well as a master plan for them, because they cannot be on a hand-to-mouth existence all the time. There are several countries around the world wherein their IP communities have been actually integrated, fully integrated to the society. They are now the shakers and movers of this country. And although in some countries there are still problems with IPs, and they're still the poorest of the poor, for example, maybe in Australia, or maybe even in the United States with the American Indian communities, but they've masterfully come up with a efficient utilization of the resources in some other countries, which has become a tool to help them get out of poverty. I hope that with the stewardship of the lady from the gentle lady from Antique and Malabon, the Committee on Finance, we can come up with a program, a long-term program for IP communities to finally say, by maybe 10 years from now, that the IPs are no longer the poorest of the poor, but the IPs are the movers and shakers of our society. I would love to see one day an IP become a senator of this republic. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I really appreciate, Mr. President, the interventions of the good senator from Bukidnon.
Mr.
Majority Leader.
President, Senator Laila de Lima wanted to interpolate, but the issue she wanted to brought out was discussed already by the distinguished senators on the floor. So at this point, may we ask Senator Drillon be recognized, and then Senator Hontiveros, Mr. President.
Senator Drillon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Majority Leader. First of all, I want to spread on the record that I support the IPs, children, the welfare of the IPs children. However, I have my concerns and my issues on the NCIP. Specifically,
Are they here?
specifically, what has happened to the Torrents title in Baguio, which has been mangled by titles, tawag doon,
Ancestral domain?
ancestral domain titles
CADT and
and
CALTIs?
CADSI over such lands as the Mansion House, and the other real estate in Baguio. And here I'm raising the question because I keep on hearing this time and again when there were a lot of titles issued over government properties in Baguio and
agree
in
with you.
other areas, so that our forest
Cover. A forest cover
forest cover have
has
shrunk.
diminished.
Now, may I just request that this issue be included in the inquiry that will be done
Yes.
by the good Senator Legarda on when the privilege speech is referred to her committee?
It will be the committee of Senator Nancy Binay, who is the chair of the Committee on Cultural Communities
All right.
and Indigenous Peoples.
So may we,
Yes.
just so we can take this matter up, may we request that the issue of the functions performed by the NCIP be included in the manner in which they have exercised their powers. Because, Mr. President, you know, I worked hard on the compliance with the law insofar as the dam that we are building in Iloilo is concerned. And Mr. President, I was the Senate President, and it took me 3 years to have that free and informed prior consent. When you know this project involves.
It was a project of national significance.
Yes.
Yes.
So these are the frustrations that we have with the NCIP, and I'm glad the good Senator Legarda has brought this up. So this is an opportunity for us to look over the operations of the NCIP, and we hope and we move that this issue be included in the referral.
I appreciate your interventions. In fact, I am one with you on those two basic points. First, the issue of overlapping titles. We've talked about that year in, year out in most hearings. And in fact, in my hearing with the NCIP, I told them, I believe that your concern should not only be in getting your CADTIs and your CALTIs or titling what you say belongs to you as part of the ancestral domain in the implementation of the IPRA, but also in other matters, in implementing or making health care and education accessible to our IP children. In fact, the subject of my speech is not on the NCIP or IPs in general, but more particularly on indigenous children. So, but I agree with you. There is no reason why the government's property, the mansion house, should be titled under the CADT or a Certificate of Ancestral Domain. And second, the stalling of projects of national significance should not be an issue because the IPRA law, I am certain the framers of it, I was not yet a senator this time, did not intend it to be a hurdle in the process of sustainable development. And so I just similar to your dam project, there is a hydro project in my province of Antique which has not been fully operational and not totally completed, also because of alleged indigenous peoples in the area who, according to the proponent, were not there in the first place in the beginning. So there are these issues on indigenous peoples which I think should not also cloud the issue of their need to be helped, to be recognized, especially our indigenous children. So thank you for that, Senator Drillon.
Thank you, Mr. President. May we now recognize Senator Ontiveros.
Senator Ontiveros is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would the good senator from Antique yield to a few questions?
Yes, it would be my pleasure to answer the questions of the lady senator from Region 6 as well.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank the good senator for her speech on indigenous children. I've heard many speeches on indigenous peoples in general, but as she said, today she has, if not for the first time, in one of the rare times, brought out in public the specific concerns of indigenous children. Before I go to my few questions about her speech, Mr. President, I'd just like to think aloud that the earlier discussion between the good senator from Antique and the good senator from Iloilo, well, may Kasimanwa, both on Panay Island, is also related to pending legislative efforts on a National Land Use Act, which is proposed by its advocates as one of the laws where competing claims from different social reform measures, whether the IPRA or the Agrarian Reform Law or others, could be, where conflicting or seemingly conflicting provisions of these laws could be harmonized. So, but to my first question, Mr. President, on the political participation, representation, and leadership of, well, indigenous children when they come of age, I'm interested in the initiatives that the good senator from Antique said government has undertaken. What are the main planks of the IP participation framework that the good senator mentioned?
The programs that I cited are programs existing in the various government departments. I still need to see its effectivity. In fact, I know for a fact that the use of the mother tongue is instituted in DepEd. The coordination between DILG and the other agencies of government and the NCIP, that I am not certain that the effects on our indigenous families are actually felt. In fact, let me be very candid with you. The programs which I cited look like interesting programs that would address the needs of our indigenous children. But honestly, on the ground, I don't think it makes a difference. That's a reason why I intend to bring this out in crafting our budget so that it's more responsive to our indigenous peoples. I think our Department of Health Secretary is here.
Yes.
She was here earlier.
Still here.
Yes, Sec Pauline Obial. I hope that in the in our health budget that there could be a clear effort to reach out to the 15 million indigenous peoples and the 6 million indigenous children, so that the benefits that a non-indigenous child, Filipino child, would receive from government would be the same benefits that one of the 6 million indigenous children would benefit from. I learned from them that in the DSWD 4-piece program, while it is recognized that there are indigenous families, the requirements are difficult to fulfill. Because what are the requirements of the 4-piece? I mentioned earlier that they should be in school. Yes, in a regular school. But many of them live very far. There is no school. Takes them to walk kilometers. They don't even have money for breakfast. They don't have slippers. They don't even know the language which is being used in the school, whether it's in the local dialect or language, it's in Bisaya, in Kinaraya, but it may be a different language of the indigenous child. And the other requirements, to be able to access the 4Ps, you need to be compliant with the reproductive health, for example. What if they're not even in touch with the DOH representative, or there is no rural health center in their area, the mountain range where they're from? And so it is very difficult for them to even be a member of the 4Ps because they're non-compliant. There has been a suggestion to tweak the compliance with the 4Ps for indigenous families that would be more attuned to what they can fulfill based on their culture.
Well, Mr. President, since the good senator already mentioned again one of the other initiatives she mentioned in her speech, I'll segue to what she pointed out as basic health services. And as far as I can remember, good chair of the Senate Committee on Finance, during the first hearing the good chairperson conducted on the budget of the Department of Health, in fact, the good secretary mentioned that one of their plans within their 5-year strategic plan in order to fulfill their Philippine health agenda would be within the framework of primary health care to extend checkups to the 20 million poorest Filipinos. And as the good senator knows, always counted among poorest of the poor would be our indigenous people,
Yes.
including the indigenous children.
Yes, there
And
are
my-
15 million indigenous peoples,
Peoples.
and 6 million of them, I believe, are children.
So what would the good senator suggest should be main elements or characteristics of these basic health services in order to create the greatest impact for the health of our indigenous children?
Well, first, we should know where they are. So locating them by including them in our census data is very important. Second, if we have outreach workers, extension workers, I call them, in the SWD, so that they are covered in the 4Ps. And with the benefits of the 4Ps, perhaps the DOH can use that same database to provide them access to basic health services, and even perhaps providing them in their barangay, in their sitio, with a health care center, a health unit, with basic health care facilities, and even just teaching them how to wash, teaching them basic sanitation. That's very important. Even teaching them nutrition. I shook the hand of some of our friends from the Nutrition Council. In fact, I'm glad that you are here, the Secretary of Health. Perhaps the Nutrition Council can include in their program, which we will support, something very particular for our indigenous children. In fact, if the Department of Health would have a special program to reach out to our indigenous peoples with the Nutrition Council, that would make a lot of difference to our indigenous children.
Mr. President, I'm glad that the good senator pointed out that the National Nutrition Council is also here today in the Senate, because we're in the Committee on Health as well. We are really looking at them as partners in a good number of bills that we're hearing now on the first 1,000 days nutrition program for our children, of course, to include indigenous children. To continue,
In fact,
yes.
if I may just mention, before we segue from the Nutrition Council, something very simple and can be done. The Nutrition Council can actually promote the planting of malunggay, of saluyot, and other easy-growing, calcium-rich plants. And where available, where feasible, depending on the terrain or the area where the indigenous families are. And they can actually map the areas and whichever will grow best there, which the National Nutrition Council would know better. So let's find out where the 15 million are, and we have basic information about that. The NCIP should be able to help with that, and the PSA, and then to provide health centers, if possible, in those areas, and the National Nutrition Council with the DA, with the DepEd, or even by themselves to help them plant and eat their own organic malunggay or organic saluyot, and to, as I said, teach them basic health and sanitation for their daily needs.
In fact, Mr. President, I was going to mention that the indigenous peoples in their ancestral domains are among the most familiar with those nutritious plants that and plant foods that
Yes.
the good senator has just mentioned. And on the other end, from that primary health care nutrition point, they are also the custodians of a lot of the medicinal plants.
That's true.
Which which are
Which we
endemic
can
to the
learn
Philippines.
from, yes.
Which we can learn from, and I'd like to hear a little more from the good senator about that.
Yes, I am sure also that the Department of Health would have, because you have the Bureau of Alternative
That's PTAC,
Yes.
good senator, Philippine Institute for Traditional and
for
Alternative
traditional
Healthcare.
alternative
Opo.
medicine. And our indigenous peoples have their indigenous knowledge systems in agriculture, in environment, and in health, which can be preventive and curative. And many of our herbs and plants, which we living in this urban jungle may not know, but they actually know it. So there's much that we could learn from them. In fact, if both the DOH and the Nutrition Council can have that program, that would be great. Why don't we model those areas in indigenous communities? Gulayan or herbs based on what's available there, and teaching the children and the families how to cultivate a small plot of land to make it sustainable for their families.
Lastly, Mr. President, on this point of the basic health services, perhaps also with the leadership of the DOH, there can be more exploration of the role that indigenous healers can play in our community health teams or in reinforcing the human resources which are who are primarily deployed by the DOH to serve the health needs of our communities. And these would include the indigenous children to whom these indigenous health-seeking habits would be passed down, would be passed on from their elders.
I agree with you. In fact, I would go one step further, if I may. I would request the DOH to help document the indigenous health practices and rituals of our indigenous peoples so that aside from it being passed on by the elders and the indigenous health practitioners to the children, we could, if allow, assuming there's FPIC, we could document it and learn from it if they allow.
Mr. President, moving on to another point earlier mentioned by the good senator from Antique, the modified CCT. She already mentioned that the requirements currently are difficult to fulfill, but what does the good senator suggest should be the main modifications on the basic CCT to make it more truly responsive and poverty alleviating for the indigenous children and their families?
It would be the NCIP and the DSWD that could know that best.
Okay.
I was just informed that the compliance for children of school age must be in school, and the health compliance that they must abide by certain requirements is sometimes difficult to be met. And so perhaps the NCIP must reach out, or DSWD must reach out to each other, and they must, I'm willing to put it in a special provision under the CCT program of a DSWD in the GAA, so that the implementation of that will be, how do you say it, more loose or changed or modified, so that we can have more inclusivity in the implementation of the 4-piece program to include more indigenous peoples.
To the last point, Mr. President, mentioned by the good senator in her speech, or the last initiative, the IP Education Office and the mother tongue-based multilingual education. Are these sufficient as of now, for example, to not just extend the alternative learning systems of DepEd to indigenous children, but also somehow, in the same way we discussed about the health practices of the indigenous people, somehow to incorporate maybe indigenous learning systems into the mainstream
I would like that.
learning
In
systems
fact,
of the country?
yes. First, the use of mother tongue. I'm not sure that it is actually being done in all areas where there are indigenous peoples. I think it's just been modeled. It was Secretary Luistro who I always had healthy engagements with when it comes to the use of mother tongue. Not everybody agreed on that, but I am agreeable to that. And I think that it was just modeled. I am not certain. I have to ask Secretary Briones in which areas of the country this is being implemented. But apart from that, why limit it to them? There's so much we could learn from them. And even, we have more than 100 languages, 180 if I'm not mistaken. And some languages have died or forgotten. Some languages are just existing with just a few people speaking it in some remote island, let's say in Samar. So this is so interesting, and this is part of our cultural identity as a nation. And so, yes, having including it in the curriculum, in our DepEd curriculum would be so interesting. So it's not just having it in IP communities, but allowing the non-IPs to understand it better. I think that would be great. Just to let the good senator know, and I'm so excited by all your questions, we were able to document indigenous agricultural and environmental practices in the through the 6 universities, state universities and colleges in the Cordillera. And we hope to do that with regional SUCs in various regions where there are IPs, so that we document their indigenous agricultural environment practice. Now, I would like to add, based on your wise intervention, the indigenous health practices, which actually comprises the indigenous knowledge systems.
Thank you so much, Mr. President, for that very interesting update, which I think will turn into a valuable resource for us as we continue forging policies for the indigenous peoples and indigenous children. Just a last follow-up question on the first initiative that we talked about, the participation framework. Does the good senator think that also the indigenous peacekeeping, peacemaking, and peace-building ways of the IPs, which their elders try to teach to their children, should also somehow be incorporated
Of course,
in our
yes.
local governance mechanisms, for
That's part
example?
of their culture, the Peace Pact, the Budong, the many things, the different peacekeeping efforts of our indigenous peoples should be preserved, should be understood, should be documented, if possible, by perhaps state universities. It actually would be a good idea if our state universities and colleges, where there are indigenous peoples in that province or region, could help in the documentation efforts of health, of peacekeeping, of agriculture, of environment, of tangible and intangible heritage.
Thank you, Mr. President. One final follow-up. I really would like to appreciate the fact that the good senator highlighted the importance of the initiative of the modified CCT, because as she has often reminded us, among the poorest of the poor in the Philippines, aside from small fisher folk, will always be the indigenous people and their children. So thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you very much. Good
I
Senator.
truly appreciate the very enlightened questions of the good senator from Panay as well, and I hope that everything on record, that I will be reminded to include those special provisions in the budget. So thank you. And I'm glad that this Department of Health is present here today, Secretary Ubial, and the National Nutrition Council. Parang tayo nag-meeting. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Legarda. Majority Leader?
Mr. President, I move to refer the privileged speech of Senator Legarda to the Committee on Education, Arts and Culture, and secondarily to the Committee on Youth.
There's a motion to refer the privileged speech of Senator Legarda, as well as the interpellation thereon, to the Committee on Education, and secondarily to the Committee on Youth. Any objection? Hearing none, the motion is approved.
Mr. President, with the consent of the Chamber, I move to consider PS Resolution 205.
205. Is there any objection? Hearing none, PS Resolution 205 is in order.
May we ask Secretary to read the title of the measure without prejudice to inserting into the records the entire text of the resolution? Only the title, Mr. President.
Resolution authorizing all regular standing committees, oversight committees, and special committees of the Senate to conduct hearings, meetings, and consultations during the recess of the 7th Congress to have continuity in the process of passing pending proposed legislations and to conduct investigations on issues of national interests to aid in crafting relevant legislation.
Majority Leader?
Mr. President, I believe the resolution is self-explanatory, so with the consent of the Chamber, I move to adopt PS Resolution 205, subject to style.
Is there any objection? Hearing none, PS Resolution number 205 is adopted, subject to style.
Mr. President, one final housekeeping chore. Pursuant to Section 25 of Republic Act 9189, otherwise known as the Overseas Voting Act of 2003, I'd like to manifest the following members of the Senate to the Joint Congressional Oversight Committee on the Overseas Voting Act of 2003. For the majority, Senator Frank Drillon as chair. Members, Pangilinan, De Lima, Angara, Ejercito. For the minority, Senators Recto, Escudero, Trillanes IV, Mr. President.
The manifestation of the Senate contingent to the Joint Congressional Oversight Committee on the Overseas Voting Act is noted.
Mr. President, I move to adjourn the session until 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Wednesday, October 19, 2016.
Is there any objection? There being none, the session is adjourned until 3 o'clock in the afternoon of Wednesday, October 19, 2016.